So to begin, we're going to turn to the paper on sexual disembodiment and just to review it briefly here. And as you recall, in the paper, we defined sexual disembodiment as the state where bodily sensations of sexual experience are, to greater or lesser degrees, split off from conscious awareness. Sexual disembodiment inhibits a corporeal or bodily or even spiritual opening to the pleasurable flow of sexual energy. So this is the idea, that emerged for writing this article was, to what extent are we in relationship to our sexuality, not just from our minds, right, which has been the theme of this course, from a holistic, a deeper sense. And so it took about 10 years to write this article after the Sexuality as a Transformational Path, which is the article that opened this course, right? Understanding sexuality as life force energy, sexuality as grounded in our lower belly and our vital center, but also connected to our heart, connected to our mind, our consciousness, right? And all of who we are. And so, what is a state when our vital center, right, or our lower chakras are blocked and we don't have access? And what are the causes of that? And so, in this article, we define sexual energy as the felt experience of vitality, desire, and sensuality within the body. This does not reduce sexuality to genital sensation, but recognizes that genital pleasure is but a part of the whole bodied pleasures of being alive. An added piece, right, from the first article here is that this sexual energy is also part of earth energy, right? It's part of cosmic energy. On a molecular level, it's part of the energy of the sun, right? The energy of the waters, an elemental energy, right? Of our primal earth nature. Um, on a transcendent spiritual level, it's also this deep part of this deep mysterious life force or cosmic consciousness, right? That comes into our bodies, and our bodies exist as a locus or a channel or a focus for this sexual energy to vitalize us and connect us to deep senses of pleasure and ecstasy as human beings. And so then sexual embodiment is the definition where sexual energy is grounded into the body in such a way that we are able to attend to the moment to moment cultivation of the mind body relationship. And as we explore in the article, if we have enough safety, if we have enough support, if we have enough connection, we can have physiologically a regulated nervous system that allows our shoulders to relax, that allows our breathing to become slow, that allows us to begin to open slowly to the pleasures of nature and sensuality and sexuality around us. Uh, I'm working with one client right now who's very disassociated from her bodily experience and her sexuality. And even the idea of going outside is scary to her because there's too much stimulation. There's clouds, there's trees. And so we're working on through the window of her home, helping her to connect to the clouds, for instance, right? To begin to open just ever so subtly to the sensual world. Um, and something that I've been connecting her with is the Zen Japanese practice of forest bathing, right? Where you do conscious, intentional excursions into the natural world, right? For an hour or two, you set a threshold, you move in, you notice your senses, right? But because you have a structured container, you're able to open much more deeply than you would if you were just on your own, going out into nature without the intention and the structure, right? To begin to open to your embodiment in this way. So, sexual disembodiment originates from sexual trauma. And because we have an expanded understanding of sexual trauma, here, trauma, as it is traditionally understood, as anything that overwhelms your capacity to be present with and or integrate your experience. deregulating the body's natural rhythm, right? And so this is a very broad definition, right? You could go to a movie theater and, you're seeing Godzilla on the screen and there's lots of noise and you can't really be present and integrate your experience. Hopefully, after the movie, you can talk with a friend, you can integrate it. So this is a very, gradual experience. Did you ever have, someone who was present, someone who had those bright eyes to connect with you, to ask you what your experience is? How are you feeling, right? How are you? Who in your life can you be present with? And this reality of presence and intimacy is fundamental for developing embodied sense of self, right? When we're continually overwhelmed, and we all have different degrees of sensitivity, right? Depending on how empathic we are, depending on many different factors of our soul incarnational process, or if you like, our personality. And that sensitivity is going to, be very diverse across human beings. What is traumatic to you might not be traumatic to me. And that's very true also of sexual trauma in the sense of, certain instances of sexual abuse, molestation, rape, even, are not understood as a negative experience to the degree that for someone it could be the be all and end all of their life, where they shut down and they no longer, were able to connect to their own life force. And for others, it was something, unpleasant that happened. For others, it was something pleasant that happened, but confusing, right? So there's a huge gradient. And one thing we need not assume is that someone's experience is as harmful as we might assume it to be, right? Although, that's a big discussion. It depends on the context and the situation. And in the article, we go on to discuss this broader understanding of sexuality as experiences that block or distort this natural flow of our sexual energy, our innate connection or developmentally achieved connection to our own vitality, our own life force, our own sense of sensuality, right? From an embodied place. And we go on to suggest that there are three definitions that we present. This first one is devitalization, which is an environmental trauma, which stems from a lack of vital coherence in the developmental environment. So if you are fundamentally a thriving life force, vital, vibrant child, as all children are, right, that come into the world, um, you're going to naturally resonate with those kinds of experiences in that kind of an environment that is vitally coherent with your own life force, right? So you can think back to your childhood and even till now, what are those experiences that fill you most with passion, fill you most with creativity, fill you most with life? And if you have any children close by to observe, you see this vitality and this life pouring out of them in particular ways. And so in this definition, we think of like a plant that needs to thrive, needs rich soil, needs regular water, needs all the nutrients and environmental conditions in order for it to thrive. There might not be anyone that is going to cut that plant, right? That is going to do damage, in the sense that there might not be anyone who is sexually abusing you or doing explicitly sexually harmful things to you, but they themselves, your caregivers, the environment around, have sexual wounds or are closed down sexually or have certain sexual challenges because they're not aligned with their own life force. So here you are, like this plant trying to grow, and you're like, well, where are the nutrients? What's going on? So there's a sense of confusion that happens. There's a sense of devitalization, right? Vitality is the energy, the life force energy that you have at your disposal to thrive. The devitalized state is a lack of life force energy, right? A diminishment of that energy, right? So there's a graying, there's a darkening, right, of one's life. And this is very helpful particularly for individuals who haven't experienced explicit sexual trauma or abuse, to understand that you can carry sexual trauma in the sense that you don't have vital coherence. So there's this, something is missing, something is absent. I'm depressed, something's heavy, right? And it's a chronic, trauma that happens. Then there's the interpersonal form of sexual trauma, which has to do with deep emotional wounds and how they constellate when it comes to physical or interpersonal intimacy. Um, the threat or phobia of intimacy, it can be so deeply embodied when we weren't attended to as a baby, as an infant, as a small child, because our cries for connection were not heard. So then when it comes to being physically close with another person, it's going to awaken that part of us as a very small child, even as a nonverbal infant, that says, never again will I allow myself to feel the pain of this intimacy, right? So a lot of sexual addictions, so-called sexual pathologies, are the result of someone who is inherently sexual but is phobic of intimacy. So I'm going to objectify my sexual partners in such a way that there's not real heart-to-heart connection. There is a distancing, right? And so this sexual objectification, fetishization, pornographication can be driven by this deep fear of intimacy, right? And this deep fear of intimacy drives sexual obsessions in a more intense way, right? And that's not to say at all that there are healthy ways to enact sexual fantasies, to engage pornography, to engage all kinds of different sexual possibilities, right? But there is something we'll be looking at in a few slides. There is a question that we can ask about our sexual desires and fantasies, or the sexual desires and fantasies of others, right? How much of this is intertwined with some kind of sexual trauma or fears or wounds or a devitalized environment, and how much of it is actually in integral alignment with my holistic self? And then the third piece is what we commonly think of as sexual trauma, right? Which are these explicitly distressing sexual experiences that go to the core of our life force, the core of our being, um, and how we understand these experiences. Depends. As I mentioned, it varies from individual to individual, but generally for children, they are full of confusion, full of shame, full of, you know, um, fear, silence, secrecy. And, a big part of the healing process here is, how do we begin to share our stories? Just like Jin was so courageously doing at the beginning of this class, right? And just like so many of you are courageously doing on the discussion boards, right? Taking this opportunity to share something of your experience, as difficult as it might be. So sharing your story, allowing some oxygen and some light to get into some of these difficult experiences. So that's sexual conflicts, the situational sexual trauma, the interpersonal sexual trauma, that almost every relational sexual conflict, as I mentioned, is founded on emotional conflicts, right? Fears, shame, confusion, lack of things expressed to your partner, and then the conflicts, the sex knots, as I sent out that article, build and build. So these are three ways that I offer for you, for the light of your consciousness, to understand your own path of sexual healing, and to be able to offer, that to others, should you, work as a practitioner in any way. And then, finally on this slide, there is the reality of consent. And so this is important to consider, if you think back to your sexual experiences, as Jin was mentioning, this experience of being chronically raped, chronic violation. And a violation occurs anytime we don't have a full yes, right, from the whole of ourself. And it's a very idealistic thing to have a full yes because we're not fully integrated, and there might be a part of me consciously, my ego said yes, but my heart was really saying no, right? My conscious mind was saying yes, but my inner child was really saying no, right? My heart and my mind were saying yes, but my spirit was saying no, right? And so a full holistic yes asks the question, like, am I saying yes? Have I been able to check in, right? Do I have the self presence to give consent? Um, and, in the United States, no one under the age of 18, right, has the legal right to give consent to someone who's over the age of 18. But at what point, really, how many humans have enough self-presence to really say yes, right? And in what relationships? And so it's important to imagine sometimes we might feel like, well, I don't have any experiences of sexual abuse or violation. But then I think back in the sexual experiences I did I really know myself at all? How lost was I? How grounded was I in my truth? How grounded was I in my heart? How grounded was I in my conscious awareness, right? And so many people that I work with, come to me with confusions around their sexuality or around, severe depression or around confusion, spiritual questions. And, it's very common that they have a sexual history, maybe with a partner they're married to, right, for decades. And yet there's been a lot of confusion around that experience, right? Um, so it's important to, just reflect on the nature of the yes. Right? Is it real? Is it deep? Is it grounded? So just to summarize the dynamics of sexual embodiment, this is from the conclusion of the article. Sexual trauma overwhelms the capacity to integrate experience. Therefore, unresolved trauma, whether developmental, systemic, or acute, results in fear and distress in the face of sexual experience. This fear and distress causes a defensive response of disassociation when an individual's sense of safety is threatened. So, this sense of going blank, of being disconnected, of no longer being present to myself, right? We know when trauma is triggered by these cues, and the cue is disassociation in particular, right? I go blank, I go numb, I no longer am present. Um, there's an example in the footnote number 2 of the article of the teenage girl who talks about her first sexual experience when she was 14 and her boyfriend started kissing her and she thought it would be so fun because she's getting his attention. And all of a sudden she can't feel her body. All of a sudden she doesn't know where she is. Right. So this disassociative response is like an inner message from our soul saying there's something that needs to be resolved here, right? There's something that is not seen. It brings us into unconsciousness. But if we can notice the onset of disassociation, right, that is the key to waking up and transforming this whole pattern, which is why gentleness and safety is a key, because if we're constantly jumping into the deep end, we're not giving ourselves enough spaciousness to notice the onset of disassociation. So I think that spaciousness, again, to use you as an example, Jen, of, I just want to hug. I just want to hug. Like that's the softness, that's the gentleness that's going to help me to not, get lost from myself. And then once disassociated, traumatic disassociation and the fragmented self that occurs with it leads to a disavowal of and disconnection from sexual experience. So depending on how habituated this disassociation is, it becomes a fragmented aspect of our identity, a sexual shadow, a sexual part that I can say, oh, I'm not really a sexual person. I don't really have any sexual thoughts and desires. On the one hand, we can consciously say, well, that maybe I identify as asexual and I'm just not into sexuality. But there's always this question without pushing, without, making an assumption. Um, maybe there's a disassociated identity fragment, right, that has resulted. And then lastly, sexual disembodiment becomes habituated, as I said. So this is the idea, the deeper underlying patterning of sexual disembodiment.